If you have a relationship that is literally hanging by a thread, it is a time for looking in the mirror.
Hmm.
I think that people who want to project outward onto someone else, you don't understand me, you don't get it, you don't listen, you don't do whatever you don't do. If that's your first fix, you're going to break the relationship. So I think, first of all, you have to look in the mirror and
Some experts chase attention, but the smart ones build authority. You're listening to the Authority on Demand podcast, where credibility becomes your competitive advantage. Every week, we're pulling back the curtain on how founders and leaders turn expertise into inbound demand through books that position, media that converse, and strategies that actually move the needle. I'm Danielle Hutchinson, your host and Chief Creative Officer at Authority on Demand. Now, let's turn your authority into leverage. Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of the Authors on Mission podcast. Today, I'm going to start off with a little question for you. What if I told you that the secret to saving your marriage, fixing a relationship with your teenager, or finally connecting with that difficult coworker isn't found in a therapy office or a self-help seminar, but in the wisdom of people like Steve Jobs, Warren Buffett, and Sheryl Sandberg? Sounds crazy, right? Well, our guest today discovered something remarkable during his career as a corporate business fixer. Someone companies called when relationships were so broken they threatened billion-dollar enterprises. His insight is that the same wisdom that saves companies can save your most precious relationships. So I would love to welcome Tom Hagerty, author of The Business of Relationships, Using the Wisdom of Great Executives to Create Thriving Personal Connections. This is going to be a very powerful conversation because Tom didn't write this from an ivory tower. He wrote it while navigating his own relationships, proving that sometimes the greatest wisdom comes not from our victories, but from the willingness to rebuild from the ground up. So, Tom, welcome to our podcast. I'm so excited to have you on.
thanks, Danielle. I'm very excited to be here. Looking forward to our conversation and some good, insightful questions will come forth from you, I'm sure.
Yeah, definitely. I'm really excited for this. So, kind of just kick it off. I think we should talk a little bit about your experiences here. You had a 45-year career as a business fixer. So, what exactly does that actually mean, and how did this experience teach you about human nature?
I think a business fixer is sort of the common language that people use, but you could call it corporate turnarounds. You could call it, a banker's agent, if you will. The fixer moniker comes about because some entrepreneur, some company is in a lot of trouble. And none of these people wake up in the morning saying, I can't wait to meet somebody like Tom. I can't wait for my banker, my lawyer, my accountant. They have to call some guy like him to come into my business. And basically, what we try to do as a third party is we protect the interest of the bank first and foremost, but we also work with the business owner to get them back on the right path, whether it's in the marketing area, the finance area, whether it's overdue taxes, whether it's disgruntled employees, et cetera, et cetera. We try to put the business right. And if we can't, then we have to take other actions. But that's basically what a business fixer is. And I think in order to be in that profession or be known as one of those people, you have to be reconciled to the fact that you will never be the most popular person in the company. As I said earlier, there is no entrepreneur who wakes up in the morning saying, I just can't wait to be in such trouble that my banker has to call somebody in to help me.
Understood, right? So you kind of have to look at it with a grain of salt and some realism to understand what exactly your role is. And I guess that goes to show exactly what you do to work on it, though, right? It kind of, I would say it gives you insight to fixing those kind of relationships and changing mindsets, I suppose.
It's probably a little more direct than that. Most of the assignments that I had were of a financial nature. A business was in trouble. They were violating the codicils of their loan. Their sales were down, their profits were down, innovation was low. So those are things that are certainly relationship related in some cases, but they're black and white. They're on a balance sheet, they're on an income statement. So you have to first step in to fix that problem or that series of problems. And some are very short term, some are the result of some bad decisions, some bad investments, if you will. Some required people to be let go. Either they were too costly or they weren't producing. So it's a little more direct, but I think you're right. And I've said all along in my career that every problem is ultimately a relationship problem. But to fix the initial problems, to shore up the business, to protect the bank's interest, act in concert with the lawyers and the accountants, you have to fix the balance sheet, the income statement.
Understood, right. So I appreciate you giving us a little bit more insight into that. So it's clear to me that throughout all of your experiences, I mean, this was just, one role of many hats that you've had throughout your life. And you've, worked on many different projects, but ultimately then you came around to writing your book and kind of developing this, great framework for relationship building. And I was looking through it a little bit, and I think it's important to note here that you yourself went through your own struggles, and you quote say, "God saved me from more than stupidity." So I'm wondering
Yep.
if you'd like to share a little bit about how these experiences informed your understanding of relationships and resilience for the book.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think if you're going to speak with authority, if you're going to speak with credibility, you can't be a bystander. You can't be somebody who heard about it, read about it, thought about it, talked about it. You have to be in it. And I've had my relationship struggles. I mean, I had a 35-year marriage come to an end in 2022, and it was very painful.
Right.
I have three children who are thankfully grown. None of them live in my basement. They're all successful in their own right, but we had our struggles, and they needed to understand me. I needed to understand them and treat them as adults. And I'm very grateful, very thankful that today I have thriving relationships with all three of them. And, we speak regularly, do things regularly, travel regularly. So I'm very blessed for that. But I think that bystanders are not going to be credible sources of advice, nor are pundits, nor are casual observers and people with a quick turn of phrase. I think you have to be in it. And I was certainly in the thick of it in many ways as both an entrepreneur and a husband and a father and a brother and a son, and all the other roles that I've had throughout my life.
Understood. Well, you do make a good point there about how you have to be in it in order to be credible. However, one of your, central theses of the book is that CEOs can teach us a lot about relationships. So I guess that goes to show that it's because they also have built relationships, in their companies and built, thriving successes from there. Would you say that's the reason why, or exactly how did you come to that conclusion
I
about?
would say that's true to a degree. Okay. And I want to step back and sort of frame the book for your audience so that they
Yeah, of course.
understand
Yeah,
where
as we
it's coming
transition into
from.
it.
First of all, the CEO is a person who is paid very well to foster great relationships in its base essence. That is something a CEO must do. They have to have good relationships with shareholders and investors, with vendors, with customers, with employees, with other stakeholders in the company. So if they're not very highly skilled at fostering those relationships and creating a set of circumstances, if you will, that allow relationship to flourish, then I think they will be failures as CEOs. I mean, Steve Jobs was a lot of things. A nice guy, he was not, okay?
Mhm.
But he inspired tremendous loyalty among his employees. He communicated transparently. He was very direct. He was very tough to work for. But his employees respected that because they knew when he said he would do something, he did it. But to frame the book a little bit, Danielle, I would say that I don't want people to mistake the book for a series of advice from CEOs about your personal relationship, about how to trust people more, about how to be more committed or have better perspective or an appropriate sense of risk and change and all those other qualities that I talk about in the book. The quote themselves, every single one of these quotes was given in a exclusively business context. I mean, this was not relationship advice, but when I came across the quote, it was my interpretation that said, in addition to the context in which this quote was said, I think it can also apply to a personal relationship. I'll give you, for instance, real quick. Jack Welch was a supreme tough guy and a tough individual to work for at General Electric in the 80s and 90s. And Jack Welch said something in a speech to his directors of business unit, his top people. And he basically said, if you're not number one or number two in your marketplace, I will fix you, close you, or sell you. So imagine the CEO, if you will, of GE Medical, GE Finance, GE Aircraft Engines, et cetera, all the different divisions, hearing this message that if you're not number one or number two, I'll fix you, close you, or sell you. And he followed that by saying, change before you have to. Now, those 5 words were really powerful to me because number one, they're a great 5 word, quick sentence, change before you have to. But I said, what if you applied that to a personal relationship? What if you said, change before I have to, the passive aggressive BS that goes on between me and my kids? What if I changed before I had to the financial irresponsibility, the budding addiction, the aloof nature, the bad temper, on and on and on? So that's where the quotes came in for me is they illustrated something bigger than what they might have been intended or something different than they might have been intended, but they were still on point for illustrating something about risk or something about commitment or something about resilience or something about humility, et cetera. So I hope that helps your audience understand where I'm coming from here.
Understood, right. Well, I think it's great that, you do quote and mention all these CEOs, but like you said, it's not just their quotes, you're interpreting it and building upon it. And I think that's probably why you structured the book with one thought and one action after each of your essays. So it's a great way to structure your book too. Speaking of that, I'm wondering, was there any sort of decision-making process in laying out the book the way that you did, kind of in this essay format?
Well, as I often say to people, this was a book that was never supposed to be a book.
Yes,
Uh,
you did mention that too.
it started out as a series of essays, and I think the first one I wrote was the one about Steve Jobs. The quote about remembering I'll be dead soon is one of the biggest tools I use to make major decisions. Um, the context in which he said that was the very famous Stanford University commencement speech from 2005, and it was among a number of great quotes. But when I when I began to encounter these and read in a much more disciplined fashion and come across these type of quotes in shareholder letters, annual reports, interviews on TV, radio, et cetera, I started writing them down. I collected, I'm a quote collector. I'm guilty as charged as a quote collector. And when I started doing this, I said, well, what if I spun them in a way? And I started writing a couple of essays, giving them to my kids and a few close friends. And, a couple of people said, hey, we think these ought to be a newspaper column. And I
Mhm.
poo-pooed that idea and said, nah, I don't want to do that. That's not me. I sat down one day for lunch with a writer friend of mine who writes for the business press conglomerates. And I said, would you mind if I showed you a few of these? And I sent a few of them off, and he said, man, I really like these. I agree with your friends. These could be a newspaper column, and with your permission, I'd like to pitch it to my editors. And he did, and the editors came back, as I recall, several weeks later, and through him said, hey, we're not an op-ed newspaper. These are op-ed pieces. These are opinion pieces. We're a fact-based business weekly newspaper, part of a big national conglomerate, and we just don't do these kind of articles. But tell your friend if he had enough of them, they'd be a pretty good book. And once again, Danielle, I poo-pooed the idea and thought not a lot of it. But over time, he kept bugging me. A few other people kept bugging me, and finally, I said, "Okay, I surrender. I'll I'll send some of this stuff off to some publishers. He gave me some, other people gave me some, and one of them said, "We want to do this. When will you have the rest of it?" So it was very much a journey that was compressed at the end, because I would say, without any apologies and just doing it, out of just basic interest over time, I probably took 6 or 7 years to write half the book and 3 months to write the other half. So it was uh, it was very much a journey that I never thought I would be on, but here I am.
Well, hey, I think that it's really wonderful that you're sharing this story with us because our audience right now, everybody listening, are also potential authors, aspiring authors. So hearing about that process and how it went from a book that was never going to be a book to now, it's definitely interesting to learn about because people can use the story for as an example for themselves. That being said, I'm wondering, what was your selection process like then? I'm sure that there's so many different leaders you could have chosen to include in the book, for example. So did you have like a must include list that you worked from? Was there certain ones that you knew just had to be in the book over others?
I would say it was always about the strength of the quote. Now, granted, I found these business leaders. It could be on a quote website. It could be, like I said, over time, collecting it from one of their books, or an annual report, or a shareholder letter, or something like that. But it was always founded on the quality of the quote. And then the second criteria was, let me investigate who this person really is. I don't want to have a relationship book with someone who, is extremely poor at relationships. I mean, everybody has their faults. There's an old expression that says saints have a past and sinners have a future. So, nobody is going to be perfect, and there are certainly very imperfect people in the book. But I needed to investigate who they are, what they did, and then treat what they said in the context of one of the 12 qualities that are essential for great personal relationships. And that's really the filter, if you will, that I used. And when I began to flesh out those 12 qualities, and look for validation of that, whether it's the Harvard Business Review saying it, whether it was Northwestern School of Medicine, whether it was marriage.com, NBC News, all of those 12 qualities were in and around those that are essential to relationships. And once I found that, I said, can I make this quote relevant in a context of humility, or resilience, or change, or risk, or any of the other characteristics of good personal relationships? So that was the selection criteria: was quote first, something interesting, uh, person second, what are they all about? What did they do? And then third, can I spin this reasonably into a category that would illustrate a good personal relationship?
Understood. Well, it definitely did go through quite the process then and very carefully combed through also. So I was wondering if we could touch a little bit about those 12 qualities then. For example, what do you think would happen to society if we really stuck to these qualities and applied them broadly? Could you paint us a picture of that world? And, if we all were to take what you have in this book and apply it to our own lives?
Well, I think if we pay attention to the 12 qualities, and I can read them from the table of contents or try to do it from memory, but the 12 qualities, according to all of those sources, are as follows: perspective, honesty, integrity, change, risk, commitment, respect, priority, trust, engagement, humility, and resilience.
Good. You
Those,
have those memorized. I was
those,
checking the table of contents myself as you went along. Good job.
those are the 12 qualities. And like I said, a number of sources rallied around those 12. They weren't always mentioned by every source, but they were common denominators, if you will, throughout all the sources. And I think the world that we could live in, if we followed that, think about it for a minute. If people really said what they would do and then did it, if they had personal integrity, if they inspired a sense of trust, if they took appropriate risks, if they were willing to change, if they were willing to look at perspective in the long view of a relationship, and not proceed to say, everything is transitory and I'm in or I'm out, and when I'm out and goodbye. If we had a sense of humility, that we were willing to see ourselves as not the center of the show all the time, if we were more resilient and we were more capable of balancing our emotions, if all those things could take place, I think we'd be in a much different world. I think we'd be in a world where we trusted each other. I think we'd be in a world where, and I know you hit on this in some of your pre-show questions, we would not have an $8 trillion problem due to failed relationships that is impacting businesses worldwide. I mean, failed relationships, workplace ghosting, quiet quitting, the great resignation, the great regret, et cetera, et cetera. None of that would exist if we valued relationships in a greater sense, with more of a sense of permanence, more of a sense of not necessarily duty, but something where you're engaged and fully committed, and and fully respectful of each other. I think it would be a very different world for us.
Understood. Well, thank you for outlining that for us. And I'm really glad that we did touch upon all public qualities so that our audience today knows a little bit more about the structure and also the implementation of your concepts here. So that being said, I'm wondering, if someone's most important relationship is hanging by a thread right now, what is the first fix that they should implement today? I would assume that maybe it has to do with relationship flexibility. For example, when you did quote Malcolm Forbes and said, if you never budge, you can't expect a push. I'm wondering if that's perhaps the first fix, or is there another fix you'd implement first?
I think the very first fix, if you have a relationship that is literally hanging by a thread, it is a time for looking in the mirror.
Mm,
You know, I think that people who want to project outward onto someone else, you don't understand me, you don't get it, you don't listen, you don't do whatever you don't do. I think those, if that's your first fix, you're going to break the relationship. So I think, first of all, you have to look in the mirror and own your part of it. The recovery community calls it keeping your side of the street clean. I'm a big advocate of that. Fearlessly looking in the mirror and say, what can I do? What can I offer? And then I think, along with that look in the mirror, so to speak, and recognizing that you own this, I think that the next thing I would do is to create space for a very open, honest exchange, but one that is very calm. Because, again, I'm assuming that, I can imagine a couple or two friends, or a boss and an employee, or whatever this relationship tension is, and it's hanging by a thread, it's literally going to go south or stay the same and go slightly north. It isn't going to go way up. You're not going to make grand gestures. You're not going to say, what we need is a luxury vacation. Let's go. you know, can I buy you a new car? That kind of thing. That's not going to fix years of neglect or whatever. So again, look in the mirror, and then be transparent, but be calm, and try to de-escalate the situation, to allow the relationship to survive momentarily, and then work on the rebuilding process, which is a long-term investment.
understood. I thank you so much for outlining that for us. I think it's really important to think about, the practical steps that we could be taking after this podcast today, and also after, reading your book. um, So that being said, this is your first book, and you mentioned to me that it might be your first and last book, or maybe not. So I'm wondering, do you
You
happen
really
to?
read parts of this.
I'm
I
wondering.
remember writing that.
Yeah, well, I mean, I'm also curious though. Is that still the case? What would book number two be about?
I actually have four different ideas that are in varying stages of research. Everything from a retake on the Screw Tape Letters, C.S. Lewis's famous book, where he was.
Yes.
I think that the working title it's so different from this book that it makes me shudder to think about doing it. But it would be something like how to be completely unproductive and live a meaningless life. And if that was the charge, if your job, Danielle, was to corrupt me, how would you do it? What are those things you would do in the area of finance, in the areas of family, in the areas of education, in the areas of health? All of those kind of things to say, my job is to make Tom the least he can possibly be. That's one title of the book. I'm fascinated by a quote from Napoleon about genius. And there's a thought about how to be an everyday genius. And there's a few others that are in the percolation stage. But as your audience would well understand, writing a book is not an easy thing, and I just don't know if I want to take that next one on. But there are a couple of fun ideas out there that I think I'd like to explore a little more and see where they go.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that's an excellent idea. It's almost like an opposite of what this book is, then, kind of the other side of things.
I really see this. If you remember Lewis's book, he was writing as the devil, if you will, trying to instruct his trainee on how to corrupt a human being. And so he was writing this in a series of letters.
Right.
Um, I could see this being a lot of fun with trying to be a little snarky, a little humorous, a little biting, a little profane, very different from the current book. Uh, I've kind of worked through a couple of them and said, maybe that has some legs. We'll see. But, it's something that might be a little intriguing and fun to do. So,
Definitely. Well, hey, I think it's a great idea, and if you ever consider doing it, we'd love to, have you back on and chat a little bit more about it. So definitely something to think
sure.
about. All this being said, then, Tom, I'm wondering if people have been inspired by today's podcast, they want to learn a little bit more. Of course, they can check out the book, but is there any other way that they can connect with you and stay in touch and reach out for more advice? How can they get connected?
Yeah, absolutely. You can email me at businessofrelationships@gmail.com. That's a simple way to do it. I'm also on LinkedIn and I respond to messages there. I'm also on Facebook. I have a website that is in process, thetomhagerty.com. We're hoping to make it some daily or at least weekly wisdom on relationships. And I do corporate speaking engagements. I will do training seminars, and certainly coaching remotely is an option as well. So yeah, and obviously the book is on Amazon, and all that information is in the back of the book. So
Well, perfect. Amazing. We're going to have the links to that in the description box of this podcast today as well. So we can go ahead and click on over and learn a little bit more. So, Tom, it's been an insightful conversation. I really appreciate you coming on and chatting with us today. I'm wondering if you have any final thoughts to the listeners that they should take on with them as they continue on their day.
I think that relationships are foundational to the human condition. I was shocked in the first chapter just reading about what the major religions of the world have to say about relationships and how common they are, what the major philosophers have said, the various schools of thought, whether you're a Stoic or a nihilist, or whether you're Jungian or a Freudian, relationships are central to our human condition, and thriving relationships make such a difference in life, in terms of our personal health and longevity, as well as just being able to thrive with each other in community. So I think that investing in yourself and in your personal relationships, and not creating distance and not creating isolation by the conveniences that we all have, I think that's going to be essential to our health as human beings going forward in what are going to be some pretty tough times and very technologically challenged times in terms of the ability that we all have to isolate.
Well, hey, I appreciate you sharing that with us. That's a great thing to, take on with us today. It's real powerful stuff. And I love that you've been able to share that with us, especially because you've had so many experiences, and this is all just accumulation of all of that. So thanks for that. And to our listeners who want to, learn a little bit more, dive deeper into Tom's work, again, you can find the Business of Relationships on Amazon. You can visit the website, and all the links that we just talked about before, it's going to be in the description box of the podcast today. And to everybody, just remember that Tom's central message isn't just about business leaders having relationship wisdom. It's about recognizing that the same qualities that build lasting enterprises, trust, resilience, integrity, humility, they're exactly what build lasting human connections. So take that with you today. And this has been the Authors on Mission podcast. Keep writing, keep growing, and keep building those relationships that matter. We'll see you next time.
That's a wrap on another episode of the Authority on Demand podcast. If today's conversation sparked something in you, don't keep it to yourself. Share this episode with a founder or a leader who's ready to stop being the best kept secret in their industry. If you want to turn your expertise into inbound demand, head to authorityondemand.com to see how we help clients go from unknown to in demand. I'm Danielle Hutchinson, and I'll catch you on the next one. Now, go build some authority.